I'll take it off. Tonight is my first time. The giant mail-order bride declared to the lonely cowboy. I'll take it off. Tonight is my first time. Those words from the giant mail-order bride, 6 feet 2 inches of pure strength, standing in the doorway of the lonely cowboy's Wyoming cabin, changed everything for Josiah Blackwood. The broken rancher who'd been alone for 6 years and never expected any woman to want him, let alone declare her virginity on their wedding night. Magnolia Thornwell, the mail-order bride everyone back in Philadelphia called a beast and unnatural, had traveled 1,500 miles to marry a stranger, a lonely cowboy with a bad leg and a failing ranch who needed someone strong enough to survive brutal winters and harsh frontier life. But here's what made this giant mail-order bride's declaration to the lonely cowboy so powerful. She wasn't just talking about taking off her dress. She was taking off every wall she'd built around her heart after a lifetime of rejection, mockery, and men who'd called off engagements because they couldn't handle a woman who towered over them and had hands strong enough to bend horseshoes. And the lonely cowboy standing before her, this quiet, limping man whose society said was too broken to be worth loving. He was about to show the giant mail-order bride something no man ever had. That her first time could be filled with tenderness instead of shame, with worship instead of disgust, with a love so fierce it would make the Wyoming wilderness seem gentle by comparison. But what made the giant mail-order bride finally trust the lonely cowboy enough to declare, "I'll take it off. Tonight is my first time," after 3 weeks of sleeping in separate rooms? What had this lonely cowboy done that 28 years of other men hadn't, making the giant mail-order bride believe she was finally safe enough, desired enough, woman enough to give herself completely? And when the mail-order bride whispered those vulnerable words to the lonely cowboy, why did his response make her realize that her first time wouldn't just be about bodies coming together, but about two broken souls finally finding the one person in the whole territory who saw their scars as proof of survival rather than signs of failure? 3 weeks earlier, Magnolia had stepped off that train in Laramie with her eyes fixed on the ground because looking up always hurt too much. 28 years of watching men's faces change from curiosity to disgust had taught her to delay that moment as long as possible. Her carpet bag felt like it weighed nothing in her hands that could bend horseshoes, hands her father had been proud of before he died, and her stepmother called monstrous. The September wind cut through her traveling dress, and she thought about turning around. Getting back on that train, going anywhere but here where another man would see her and realize he'd made a terrible mistake ordering a mail-order bride through. Letters that couldn't show him what she really looked like. Then she heard his voice. "Miss Thornwell?" Rough like wind over prairie grass. Uncertain, like maybe he was the one afraid of being rejected. She looked up and there he was. Josiah Blackwood, Joe, the lonely cowboy who'd written her 3 letters that said more with their honesty than 1,000 pretty lies ever could. He stood 15 feet away with his hat in his weathered hands, looking up at her. Because yes, she was taller. She was always taller. And she waited for it. That look, that step backward, that closing of his face like a door slamming shut. But Joe wasn't stepping backward. He was limping forward, leaning on a walking stick because his left leg didn't work right anymore. And when he got close enough, she could see his eyes were the color of creek water in spring, and they were looking at her like she was the answer to something instead of the problem. "Mom," he said. And his voice carried something she'd never heard before when men talked to her. "Respect. You're the most substantial woman I ever seen." He paused, seemed to realize how that sounded, and his sun-darkened face actually flushed. "That's a compliment out here. I mean it as one. You look like you could survive a Wyoming winter." That's saying something. Something cracked open in Magnolia's chest. Not the careful walls she'd built. Something deeper. Something she'd thought had died completely in Philadelphia when Cornelius Whitmore had called off their engagement in front of his whole family and said, "I won't be married to a circus." Attraction. "Mr. Blackwood," she managed. Surprised, her voice came out steady. Your letter said you were a plain-speaking man. I see you weren't exaggerating. Call me Joe. Everybody does. He gestured toward a wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. Got supplies to load, then it's 3 hours north to the ranch. There's a preacher in Laramie we can see tomorrow if you're still agreeable after you've seen the place. If you're not agreeable, I'll pay your way back east. No hard feelings. No obligations, no obligations. This lonely cowboy was giving the giant mail-order bride a way out before she'd even seen his ranch, before she'd even stayed one night, before anything was final. He was giving her choice. Nobody had given her choice since her father died. I'm agreeable, she said quietly, and watched his whole face transform with a smile that looked like it didn't. Get used often enough, they loaded supplies together, and when Magnolia effortlessly hefted a 100-pound sack of flour, the store clerk's eyes went wide, but Joe just nodded his thanks and said, "Told you she was substantial," with pride in his voice. Pride, not shame. The lonely cowboy was proud of his giant mail-order bride's strength. The 3-hour ride north was the most honest conversation Magnolia had ever had. Joe told her about his ranch, about the brutal winters that could kill you if you weren't careful, about his brother, who died of fever 6 years ago, leaving him alone with 640 acres and 200 head of cattle he could barely manage by himself. He told her about the accident that crushed his leg, about the woman who'd left him after because a crippled rancher ain't much of a catch, about the town widow who'd turned down his courting with pity in her eyes that had hurt worse than his leg ever could. And Magnolia told him things she'd never told anyone, about her father teaching her blacksmithing and loving her exactly as she was, about her mother dying giving birth to her, about always wondering if her size had killed her mother, about 3 failed courtships and men who'd mocked her, about the man who'd tried to force himself on her when she was 19, and how she'd broken his arm defending herself, and how that had ruined what little reputation she had left, about her stepmother selling the bakery and throwing her out with $50 and a train ticket west. People say a lot of damn fool things, Joe said when she finished, his jaw tight with anger that wasn't directed at her. Pardon my language, but you won't hear that kind of talk on my ranch, and anyone in town who's got something to say can take it up with me. The ranch appeared as twilight painted the sky purple and gold, small but sturdy, a log cabin with smoke rising from the stone chimney, a barn that needed repair, corrals and outbuildings, modest and honest and real. It ain't much, Joe said, and uncertainty crept into his voice for the first time. It's perfect, Magnolia whispered, and meant it with her whole heart. That night the lonely cowboy showed the giant mail-order bride through the cabin and told her she could have the bedroom while he slept by the fire, that they could marry tomorrow if she wanted, but he wouldn't expect anything she wasn't ready to give, that they could take time to know each other proper before anything else. And Magnolia stared at this broken, beautiful man who was giving her safety and respect and time, and she felt that crack in her chest widen, letting in light she'd forgotten existed. They married the next day in Preacher Matthews's small church. When the preacher started the vows, Joe interrupted with "I do" before he'd even finished the question, and Magnolia said "I do" right after, without her voice shaking, and just like that she became Magnolia Blackwood, wife of a lonely cowboy, owner of a small piece of hope in a hard land. 3 weeks passed, like pages in a book Magnolia never wanted to end. Every morning she woke in the small bedroom to the smell of coffee Joe made too strong and eggs he cooked too long. And every morning she smiled because nobody had ever made her breakfast before, even badly. Every evening they sat by the fire while wind howled outside, and Joe read to her from a book of poetry his mother had left him, his rough voice stumbling over beautiful words, and Magnolia felt her heart opening like a flower that had been closed her whole life. They worked side by side, mending fences, feeding cattle, repairing the barn door that hung crooked. Joe watched in quiet amazement as Magnolia lifted beams he couldn't budge, as she hammered new supports into place, as she shoed his horses with skill that made him shake his head in wonder. And slowly, carefully, like two wild animals learning to trust. They fell in love without ever touching more than hands, passing coffee cups or shoulders brushing while washing dishes. But something was building between them, something that crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. Magnolia felt it every time Joe looked at her across the dinner table, his creek-water eyes soft with something that made her breath catch. She felt it when he braided wildflowers into her hair one Sunday afternoon, and his fingers lingered against her neck. She felt it when she caught him watching her work, his expression full of an ache she recognized, because she felt it too. They were married in law, but not in body, and the waiting was becoming its own kind of sweet torture. Then came the day that changed everything. They were moving cattle to the north pasture when a rattlesnake spooked Joe's horse. The animal reared and Joe, with his bad leg, couldn't hold on. Magnolia watched in horror as he fell, as his horse bolted, as 200 head of cattle suddenly stampeded straight toward where Joe lay stunned on the ground. She didn't think. She just moved. Magnolia threw herself off her horse and ran faster than she'd ever run, her long legs eating up the distance. She reached Joe 3 seconds before the cattle did, grabbed him under the arms, and dragged him behind a boulder with strength born of pure terror. The cattle thundered past, missing them by inches, dust choking the air, the ground shaking beneath them. When the dust settled and the cattle were gone, Magnolia was lying on top of Joe, her body shielding his, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She was shaking. She couldn't stop shaking. She'd almost lost him. This lonely cowboy who'd given her hope and home and something that felt dangerously like happiness. She'd almost watched him die. Maggie. Joe's voice was rough, his hands coming up to frame her face. Maggie, I'm all right. You saved me. You saved my life. She looked down at him and something broke. All the control she'd been holding on to, all the careful distance she'd been maintaining, it shattered like glass. Tears poured down her face, and she couldn't stop them, couldn't stop the sobs that tore from her throat. I thought you were going to die. I thought I'd lose you before I ever really had you. Joe pulled her down against his chest, his arms wrapping around her like she was something precious instead of something too big and too strong and too much. You have me, he whispered into her hair. Maggie, you've had me since the moment you stepped off that train. I'm yours. I've been yours. They lay there behind that boulder for a long time, holding each other while the sun moved across the sky, while Magnolia's tears soaked Joe's shirt, while something fundamental shifted between them. When they finally rode back to the ranch, everything felt different, charged, inevitable. That evening, Magnolia made dinner with hands that trembled. Joe set the table and kept looking at her with an intensity that made her skin feel too tight. They ate in silence that wasn't uncomfortable, just full of things that needed saying but couldn't be said with words. After dinner, Joe limped to the window and stared out at the darkening prairie. Maggie, I need to tell you something. Her heart stuttered. Here it came. The rejection she'd been waiting for. The moment he'd realized he'd made a mistake marrying the giant mail-order bride. I'm scared, Joe said, his back still to her. I'm scared I'm not man enough for you. My leg, his voice cracked. I can't do things other men can do. I can't ride hard or dance or even walk without this damn cane half the time. And you're so strong, so capable, you don't need me for anything, really. You could run this ranch yourself and do it better than I ever could. Magnolia stood, walked to him, and turned him to face her. His eyes were wet. Joe. She cupped his weathered face in her large hands. Do you know what I see when I look at you? I see a man who built a cabin with his own hands. A man who gets up every morning despite the pain and works until sunset. A man who reads me poetry and brews terrible coffee and looks at me like I'm beautiful instead of monstrous. I see the only man who ever made me feel like I was exactly enough. You are, Joe whispered fiercely. God, Maggie, you're everything. You're so damn beautiful it hurts to look at you sometimes. But I don't know if I can give you what a wife should have. What if I can't? He couldn't finish. Shame coloring his face. Magnolia understood then. He was afraid of the wedding night too, afraid his injury made him less of a man. afraid he'd disappoint her. "I'm scared too," she confessed, her voice barely audible. Joe, I'm 28 years old and I've never been with anyone. Every man who ever courted me either gave up or tried to take what I wouldn't give. I don't know how to do any of this. I don't know if I'll be any good at it. I don't even know if it's possible with someone my size." Joe's expression transformed. The shame melted away, replaced by something tender and fierce. "Maggie, you're telling me nobody's ever—" "Nobody," she whispered. "Nobody ever wanted me enough to wait. Nobody ever made me feel safe enough to try." He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch so gentle it made her want to cry again. "I want to wait as long as you need. But Maggie, when you're ready, I promise you something. Your first time won't be about what you think it will be. It won't be quick or rough or shameful. It'll be slow. It'll be careful. It'll be me worshipping every inch of you until you understand what I see when I look at you." Her breath caught. "What do you see?" "Home," Joe said simply. "I see home." That's when Magnolia made her decision. She'd been waiting her whole life for this moment, for this man, for this feeling of being cherished exactly as she was. She was done waiting. She took Joe's hand and pressed it against her heart. He could feel it racing beneath her dress. "I'll take it off," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "Tonight is my first time. But Joe, I need you to know something. I'm not just talking about my dress. I'm talking about taking off every wall I've built, every defense, every piece of armor I've worn, since I was old enough to understand that the world thought I was wrong. I'm giving you all of me. The question is, are you ready to do the same?" Joe looked at her, this giant mail-order bride who'd traveled 1,500 miles to marry a stranger, who'd saved his life that afternoon, who stood before him now offering herself with a vulnerability that took more courage than anything he'd ever seen. "I've been ready since the moment I saw you," he said. Joe took Magnolia's hand and led her toward the bedroom, and every step felt like walking into a new life. The cabin was quiet, except for the crackle of the dying fire and the sound of their breathing, which seemed too loud in the stillness. Magnolia's heart was hammering so hard, she was certain Joe could hear it. Her hands were trembling. She'd lifted 100-pound flour sacks without breaking a sweat, had dragged a grown man out of a cattle stampede, had worked metal in a forge, hot enough to burn. But this moment terrified her more than anything she'd ever faced, because this wasn't about strength. This was about vulnerability, about letting someone see all of her, every scar and insecurity, every fear that she was too much or not enough, or too broken to be loved the way normal women were loved. Joe stopped just inside the bedroom and turned to face her. The lamp on the small table cast golden light across his features, softening the hard lines weather had carved into his face. He was looking at her with such tenderness it made her chest ache. "Maggie," he said softly, "I need you to understand something. This ain't about me taking anything from you. This is about us giving something to each other, and if at any point you want to stop, we stop. No questions, no shame. You hear me?" She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "I need to hear you say it." "I hear you," she whispered. Joe reached up and gently pulled the pins from her hair, letting it fall in waves around her shoulders. His fingers were calloused and rough, but his touch was reverent, like she was something holy. "I've wanted to do that since the first day I saw you," he murmured. "Your hair catches the light like honey." Magnolia felt tears prick her eyes. "Nobody's ever said anything like that to me before." Then nobody was looking right. Joe's hands moved to the buttons of her dress, his fingers working slowly, giving her time to stop him if she wanted. "Tell me what you're afraid of." The question surprised her into honesty. "That I'll hurt you, that I'm too big, too heavy, too strong, that you'll see me without my clothes and realize I'm not built like other women, that I won't know what to do and you'll be disappointed." Joe paused, his hands stilling on the third button. "Look at me, Maggie." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "You could never hurt me, not the way you think. And as for being too big, darling, I've spent 6 years alone in this cabin wishing for someone substantial enough to weather this life with me. You're the answer to every prayer I didn't know how to say, he resumed, unbuttoning, his movements patient. And I'm scared too. Scared my leg will give out at the wrong time. Scared I won't be able to give you pleasure because my body doesn't work the way it used to. Scared you'll realize you married a broken man who can't be what you need. You're not broken, Magnolia said fiercely. You're the strongest man I've ever known. Then we're both stronger than we think, Jo said, sliding her dress off her shoulders. And we're going to figure this out together. The dress pooled at her feet, and Magnolia stood before him in her chemise and petticoat, feeling exposed and vulnerable. She wanted to cover herself with her arms, to hide the broad shoulders and muscled arms that made her look like a man in women's clothing. But Jo was looking at her like he'd never seen anything more beautiful, his eyes moving over her with an appreciation that made her feel, for the first time in her life, like a woman men desired instead of feared. My turn, Magnolia said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. She reached for Jo's shirt buttons, her large hands fumbling slightly with the small fasteners. When she pushed the shirt off his shoulders, she saw the scars, a long one across his ribs from the accident that crushed his leg, smaller ones from ranch work and hard living. The left side of his body was more damaged than the right, the muscles not quite symmetrical, evidence of bones that had healed wrong. She traced the longest scar with her fingertip. Does it hurt? Sometimes. Less when you touch it. Jo's breath hitched as her fingers explored the landscape of his body. Maggie, I need you to know, my leg, it's worse without my pants. The scars are bad. It's not pretty to look at. She met his eyes. Neither am I. We match. Jo laughed, a sound full of relief and something that sounded like joy. You're the prettiest thing I've ever seen. But yes, I suppose we do match. Two broken, beautiful people who somehow found each other in the middle of nowhere. They helped each other out of the rest of their clothing, moving slowly, giving and receiving trust in equal measure. When they were both bare, Magnolia expected to feel shame, but instead she felt free. Jo was looking at her body not with disgust but with wonder, his hands skimming over her skin like he was memorizing every curve and plane. You're magnificent, he whispered. Every inch of you. He guided her to the bed, and they lay down together, skin against skin, and Magnolia was overwhelmed by the sensation of being held, of being wanted, of being cherished. Jo kissed her slowly, deeply, taking his time, and his hands moved over her body with purpose and patience. He touched her like she was precious, like she was delicate despite her strength, like she was everything he'd ever wanted. Tell me if I hurt you, Jo murmured against her neck. Tell me if I hurt you, she echoed, because she was still afraid. Of her own strength, still afraid of breaking this man who'd given her hope. You won't, he promised. Trust yourself, the way I trust you. What followed was nothing like the rough, shameful encounters Magnolia had feared. It was slow and tender, and sometimes awkward, because they were both learning each other's bodies, learning what brought pleasure and what didn't. Jo talked to her through it, asking what felt good, telling her she was beautiful, guiding her hands to show her how to touch him. When he finally moved inside her, there was pain, but he went slowly, kissing away her tears, whispering that she was brave and strong, and his, always his. And then the pain transformed into something else. Something that built and built until Magnolia thought she might shatter from the intensity of it. Jo held her through it, moved with her, whispered her name like a prayer. When the wave finally broke, Magnolia cried out and dug her fingers into Jo's shoulders, holding on while her whole world reorganized itself around this moment, this man, this feeling of being completely and utterly connected to another human being. Afterward they lay tangled together, sweat cooling on their skin, breathing hard. Magnolia was crying again, but these were different tears. These were tears of relief and release and wonder that something could be so beautiful, that she could be so beautiful, that this lonely cowboy had given the giant mail-order bride exactly what she needed. Not just his body, but his heart, his trust, his unshakable belief that she was worthy of tenderness. "Did I hurt you?" Joe asked, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder. "No," Magnolia whispered. "You healed me." They fell asleep, wrapped around each other, two broken people who'd somehow become whole by fitting their jagged edges together. And outside the cabin, the Wyoming wind sang through the prairie grass like a lullaby for the lost who'd finally found their way home. But in the morning, everything would change. Because 15 miles away in Laramie, a telegram had just arrived for Magnolia Blackwood. A telegram from Philadelphia that read, "Cornelius Whitmore arriving next week. Claim on Magnolia Thornwell still valid. Marriage to J. Blackwood potentially fraudulent. Legal action pending." The man who'd humiliated Magnolia, who'd called her a circus attraction, who'd broken her heart in front of his whole family, he was coming to take her back. And he was bringing a lawyer who claimed their mail-order marriage wasn't legal, that Magnolia was still promised to Cornelius from their failed engagement 3 years ago, that she'd signed papers she didn't remember signing. The giant mail-order bride and the lonely cowboy had found each other, had given each other everything. But someone was coming to tear them apart, and neither of them knew that tomorrow morning, when Joe rode into town for supplies, he'd come face to face with the man who thought he owned Magnolia, the man who'd come to drag her back east, the man who saw the giant mail-order bride not as a person but as property he'd foolishly discarded and now wanted to reclaim. The fight for their love was just beginning, and it would take every ounce of strength both of them possessed to survive what was coming. Morning came soft and golden through the cabin window, and Magnolia woke, wrapped in Joe's arms, feeling like a different woman than the one who'd stepped off that train 4 weeks ago. She felt whole. She felt seen. She felt loved in a way that went bone-deep and soul-wide. Joe was still sleeping, his face peaceful in a way she'd never seen before, and she carefully extracted herself from his embrace to make coffee, wanting to surprise him with a decent breakfast for once. She was humming while she worked, actually humming, something she hadn't done since her father died. The eggs were almost done when she heard horse hooves outside, fast and urgent. And then someone was pounding on the door. Joe was up instantly despite his bad leg, pulling on his pants and grabbing the rifle he kept by the door. "Stay behind me," he told Magnolia, but she was already pulling on her dress. Her heart hammering with a fear she didn't understand yet, Joe opened the door to find Billy Thompson, the young man who ran the telegraph office in Laramie, his face flushed from riding hard. "Mr. Blackwood, ma'am. I rode out soon as I could. There's a telegram came for Mrs. Blackwood yesterday and another one this morning. The postmaster said I should bring them straight away because there's trouble coming." Joe took the telegrams with hands that had gone steady the way they did when danger was near. He read the first one and his face went hard as stone. Then he read the second, and something terrible flickered across his features. He looked at Magnolia, and she saw fear in his creek-water eyes, real fear, the kind that made her stomach drop. "What is it?" she whispered. Joe handed her the telegrams. The first one said, "Cornelius Whitmore arriving next week. Claim on Magnolia Thornwell still valid. Marriage to J. Blackwood potentially fraudulent. Legal action pending." The second one, sent just hours ago, said, "Whitmore arrived early. In Laramie now with lawyer. Coming for Magnolia tomorrow. Advise you prepare legal defense." Judge Morrison, the paper crumpled in Magnolia's hands. Cornelius, the man who'd humiliated her, who'd called off their engagement in front of everyone, who'd said he wouldn't marry a circus attraction. He was here, and he was claiming she belonged to him, that her marriage to Joe wasn't real, that she was still bound by some promise she didn't even remember making. "Over my dead body," Joe said, his voice quiet and deadly. "Maggie, look at me. Nobody is taking you anywhere. You're my wife. I don't care what papers he's got or what lawyer he brought. You're mine and I'm yours, and that's the end of it." But it wasn't the end. Billy Thompson shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Blackwood, there's more. Whitmore's been talking all over town, saying Mrs. Blackwood ran away from a legal betrothal, that she owes him money he spent on wedding preparations, that the marriage here ain't valid because she was already promised. And he brought Dalton Mercier's lawyer with him. Joe's face went pale. Dalton Mercier was the wealthy rancher who'd been trying to force Joe off his land for 2 years, who wanted Joe's water rights, who had 6 men and enough money to make trouble for anyone who crossed him. If Mercier's lawyer was involved, this wasn't just about Cornelius wanting Magnolia back. This was about destroying Joe completely. They're coming tomorrow? Joe asked. First light, according to what I heard in the saloon. After Billy left, Joe and Magnolia stood in the cabin that had become their home, their sanctuary, and faced the reality that everything they'd built could be torn apart by a piece of paper and men who saw people as property. Magnolia was shaking with rage and fear. I won't go back with him, Joe. I'd rather die than go back to Philadelphia with that man. You won't have to, Joe said, but she could hear the uncertainty beneath his determination. We'll fight this. We'll get our own lawyer. Judge Morrison is a fair man. Joe. Magnolia grabbed his arms. What if it's not enough? What if Cornelius really does have legal claim? What if I signed something I don't remember? I was so desperate to escape Philadelphia, I might have signed anything. And if Mercier's involved, you know he'll use this to take everything from you. The ranch, the land, everything you've built. Joe pulled her against his chest, his arms tight around her. Then we'll leave. We'll go to Montana or Oregon or Mexico. I don't care about the ranch if I lose you. You're what matters, Maggie. Only you. But Magnolia knew Joe was lying. Not maliciously, but because he was trying to be brave for her. This ranch was everything to him. His brother had died here. His dreams were buried in this soil. She couldn't let Cornelius and Mercier take it from him. She couldn't let loving her destroy the lonely cowboy who'd given her everything. That night they didn't sleep. They held each other and made plans and tried to find courage in each other's arms. And when dawn came cold and gray, they stood together on the porch and watched 3 riders approach from the south. Cornelius Whitmore looked exactly as Magnolia remembered, tall, handsome, well-dressed, with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. Beside him rode a sharp-faced man in an expensive suit who had to be Mercier's lawyer. And behind them rode one of Mercier's ranch hands, armed and watching. Cornelius pulled his horse to a stop 20 feet from the porch and smiled like he'd already won. Magnolia, you're looking well. Frontier life seems to suit you. My name is Magnolia Blackwood, she said, her voice steady despite her terror. And you're not welcome here. Mrs. Blackwood, the lawyer interjected smoothly. I'm afraid there's been a legal misunderstanding. You see, 3 years ago, Miss Thornwell signed a betrothal contract with Mr. Whitmore. That contract was never formally dissolved, which means your marriage to Mr. Blackwood here is, regrettably, invalid. Joe's hand tightened on his rifle. That's a lie. Magnolia came here free and clear. We married legal in front of Preacher Matthews. Did you ask if she was already contracted to another man? The lawyer asked with false sympathy. Because the law is quite clear. A betrothal contract supersedes any subsequent marriage. Miss Thornwell belongs to Mr. Whitmore, and Mr. Whitmore has generously agreed not to press charges for breach of contract if she returns to Philadelphia with him immediately. I'm not going anywhere, Magnolia said. Cornelius's smile faded. Magnolia, don't be difficult. You know you were never suited for this life. Look at yourself. You're dressed like a ranch hand, living in a cabin barely bigger than a shed, married to a cripple who can't even provide properly for you. I'm offering you a way out, a chance to come back to civilization, to live as a proper lady. I am a proper lady, Magnolia said, her voice rising. And this man you're calling a cripple is worth 10 of you. He sees me as I am and loves me anyway. He gave me a home and respect and tenderness you never even thought to offer. I'm not leaving him. Not for you, not for anyone. The lawyer sighed like this was all very tedious. Mr. Blackwood, perhaps you'll be more reasonable. Mr. Mercier has authorized me to offer you $500 for your cooperation. Return Miss Thornwell to Mr. Whitmore, and we'll forget this whole unfortunate situation. Refuse and we'll tie you up in court for years. Legal fees alone will bankrupt you. And when the judge rules that your marriage is invalid, and he will, you'll have nothing. No wife, no money, and potentially charges of kidnapping a contracted woman. Joe raised his rifle. Get off my land! Violence won't help you, the lawyer said. We'll be back with the sheriff. You have until noon to make the right decision. They rode away, and Magnolia collapsed against Joe, her whole body shaking. This was her nightmare. Not just losing Joe, but destroying him in the process. Ruining the lonely cowboy who'd saved her by loving her. We have to think, Joe said, his voice urgent. There has to be something, some way to prove that contract isn't valid, or that you dissolved it, or, Joe, I don't even remember signing anything. But what if I did? What if in my desperation to escape, I signed papers I didn't read? What if they're right and our marriage isn't real? It's real, Joe said fiercely, gripping her shoulders. I don't care what any paper says. What we have is real, but real wasn't always enough. Not when the law was on the side of men with money and power. Not when the system was designed to treat women like property that could be bought and sold and claimed. Magnolia felt despair closing around her throat like a noose. Then she heard horses again, but this time they were coming from the north, and there were more of them. 6 riders appeared over the rise, and Magnolia recognized Gloria Wellington, Joe's mother, who he'd said was dead. Except she wasn't dead. She was very much alive, and riding like her life depended on it. And beside her was Preacher Matthews and Judge Morrison, and 3 ranchers from neighboring properties. Gloria dismounted with surprising agility for a woman in her 60s and marched straight to Joe. My son, you are a terrible liar. You wrote me that you were getting married and everything was fine, but I could read between those lines. I knew something was wrong, so I came. And I brought help. Judge Morrison stepped forward, his stern face softening as he looked at Magnolia. Mrs. Blackwood, I took the liberty of sending a telegram to Philadelphia after I received notice of this legal challenge. I have connections there from my days as a territorial attorney, and I received a very interesting response this morning. He pulled out a telegram and read, Betrothal contract between Cornelius Whitmore and Magnolia Thornwell dissolved by mutual. Agreement November 1873. Contract. Termination filed with Philadelphia County Court. Whitmore claim invalid. Signed, Clerk of Courts, Philadelphia County. Magnolia's knees went weak. But I don't remember. Your father filed it, Judge Morrison said gently. 3 months before he died. It seems he knew Whitmore wasn't good for you and took steps to protect you legally. The contract was dissolved. Your marriage to Josiah is completely valid. Relief hit Magnolia so hard she had to grab Joe's arm to stay standing. They were safe. Their marriage was real. Cornelius had no claim. Gloria stepped forward and took Magnolia's face in her weathered hands. Welcome to the family, daughter. My son has terrible taste in when to tell his mother important things, but excellent taste in wives. Any woman strong enough to save his stubborn hide from a cattle stampede and put up with his coffee is a blessing from God. The neighboring ranchers stepped forward too. Men Joe had helped over the years, men who owed him favors and respected him despite his injury. We heard Mercier was making trouble, one of them said. Figured you could use some witnesses and some extra guns if Whitmore doesn't take no for an answer. When Cornelius and the lawyer returned at noon with the sheriff, they found not an isolated cabin with 2 vulnerable people, but a united community standing firm. Judge Morrison presented the evidence. Preacher Matthews testified to the validity of the marriage. Gloria Wellington declared loudly that anyone who tried to take her daughter-in-law would have to go through her first. And the sheriff, who'd known Joe since he was a boy, told Cornelius and Mercier's lawyer to get out of his territory before he found reasons to arrest them. Cornelius looked at Magnolia one last time. You're making a mistake. You could have had everything in Philadelphia. I already have everything, Magnolia said, taking Joe's hand. I have a man who loves me, a home that's mine, and a life worth living. You never could have given me that, because you never saw me as a person. You saw me as something to own. Joe sees me as someone to love. That's the difference. They rode away, defeated and furious, and Magnolia watched them disappear over the horizon, feeling like she'd just won a war. The community stayed for dinner, crowding into the small cabin, and Gloria regaled everyone with embarrassing stories about Joe as a boy, while he blushed and Magnolia laughed until her sides hurt. When everyone finally left, promising to check in regularly and help with spring roundup, Joe and Magnolia stood on their porch and watched the sun set over land that was theirs. A future that was theirs, a love that no one could take away. "I love you, Maggie Blackwood," Joe said, pulling her close. "My substantial, magnificent, perfect wife." "I love you, Joe Blackwood," Magnolia whispered. "My brave, tender, beautiful husband." They'd both been broken when they found each other. Both been told they weren't enough, weren't right, weren't worthy of love. But together they'd built something unbreakable. A giant mail-order bride and a lonely cowboy, standing against the Wyoming wind, proving that sometimes the most unlikely people make the most perfect match. And that night, in their small cabin under the vast western sky, they made love again with the certainty that nothing and no one could ever separate them. They'd fought for each other. They'd won. And they'd spend the rest of their lives being grateful they'd both been brave enough to answer a mail-order advertisement that changed everything. 6 months later, Magnolia would give birth to a daughter as tall and strong as her mother, who Joe would call My Little Miracle. A year after that, they'd expand the ranch, hire hands, and become one of the most successful operations in the territory. With Magnolia's blacksmithing skills and Joe's ranching knowledge combining into something neither could have achieved alone. And 50 years later, their grandchildren would still tell the story of how the giant mail-order bride and the lonely cowboy found each other in the wilderness and built an empire on love, trust, and the simple revolutionary act of seeing each other exactly as they were. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story about love, courage, and finding where you belong. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? What would you have done in Magnolia's position? Drop your city and country below. We love hearing from you around the world, and your stories inspire us to keep bringing you these tales of hope, redemption, and the kind of love that changes everything.